Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So today I thought I would do a video on the most recent junior slash resident doctor strike that took place in December because I know it caused a lot of controversy. Now, I didn't want this to be a video where I just kind of like give over my opinion because, well, anyone could do that and you're not interested in that. We're going to try and think about it from an economics perspective here. But I suppose maybe like to some extent my opinion might be obvious from that. So the only opinion that I will kind of explicitly give is I am by no means against unions. I think unions are fantastic because if you don't have unions, then essentially the employer holds all the power and they can definitely kind of abuse and mistreat their workers and pay them kind of low money, and there's not much you can do about it. So I think unions are necessary. We're not going back into that kind of that era where people think, well, like Margaret Thatcher was amazing because she was kind of like fighting against the unions. I don't want to go back there. But I also do think unions can abuse their power, and it's based on how much I know the whole point of striking is to cause disruption, but unfortunately some groups of labour are just able to cause more disruption than others, and I don't necessarily think that therefore shows how valuable they are, how valuable their work is. I'm going to call them resident doctors rather than junior doctors to kind of honour the name change that took place back in, I don't know what it was, September or something, because junior doctors didn't like being called that because it came across as, I suppose, kind of a bit diminishing what they are. And not taking into account their talents and their skills and stuff like that. So it was in December, end half of it, that the resident doctors, went on strike, and it caused a big controversy because there was a big flu epidemic. So people had opinions on whether or not they thought it would be okay to kind of, or morally right to strike when that was happening. But also the healthcare system is under a lot of strain at the moment, and people are on long waiting lists to be seen. Now, to kind of set some context here, resident doctors make up a quarter or nearly a quarter of doctors in the UK. So by no means is it kind of a small number. It's quite a large proportion. So when they strike, we'll feel the effects of it. They're not happy as well because, well, the main argument is overpay, but they're also not happy because a lot of resident doctors have to, after the end of their kind of foundation years, they are meant to apply for a specialty, and there's been loads of problems with there not being enough specialty training places, and therefore a lot of them are essentially they call themselves being unemployed afterwards because they haven't got a place on their specialty program. Now, Wes Streeting, the health secretary, obviously didn't want them to go on strike and was trying to offer them some certain deals to try and encourage them not to go on to strike. And particularly, is there any way that you could just wait till January to get Christmas and kind of this flu epidemic out of the way? And what he focused on in terms of his kind of offer, it wasn't entirely pay-based because, well, we don't have the resources for that. But also they have been awarded previously a pay rise of 28.9% previously, which is one of the highest pay increases achieved in the public sector. So I think, if I remember correctly, Wes Streeting's kind of offer included for training places, because there was problems with that there was legislation pushed through that kind of UK graduates got priority there, therefore hopefully lowering the level of competition. There was this kind of promise to increase the number of training places, and also once you're a doctor, the costs don't stop there. There's like exam fees and stuff like that. So they were going to kind of like waive those fees and also backdate it for the poor kind of resident doctors that had paid them just recently and didn't have this offer on the table. Anyway, lo and behold, that offer got rejected, which does kind of make you think that they were much more interested in just the pay approach than anything else. And again, for context, the base salary of a kind of a foundation year one doctor, from what I've looked online, I've looked on the BMA website, is in the high 30s. It's something like 38,000, maybe 39,000. It doesn't normally end up being that. It normally ends up being a little bit more because they get paid for unsocial hours, for example, night times, or weekends, which you don't get much of a say over when you're a resident doctor, and so on. Okay, so that's kind of setting the context there. Now, from an economic perspective, a strike is used as kind of like a bargaining tool. So workers withhold their labour to try and improve their position when it comes to wage negotiations, which means strikes obviously only work if that particular labour force have any kind of bargaining power in the first place. Now, resident doctors have an unusually large amount of bargaining power for a few reasons. So firstly, they provide kind of an essential, necessary service. And the demand for the healthcare doesn't disappear when doctors decide to strike or don't work. They are highly trained, which means that in the short run you can't quickly replace them. This has become even more powerful given this kind of like anti-immigration narrative that's going on at the moment. So it's not like you could just say, well, we'll just kind of allow workers from other countries to come over and do the job instead. So that kind of improving things in the short run's become even harder. And the NHS could be argued to be called what's a near monopsony employer. There are limited other options in the UK for doctors to kind of be a doctor. You can be private, but NHS is kind of a big one, which means when they all come together collectively, they have quite a strong collective power. Now, all of the arguments online keep batting around stuff like fair wage, and like in particular saying once you work it out per hour, it's something like, I don't know, it was something like less than minimum wage, not less than minimum wage, but it wasn't very high, something like £15. And I saw someone saying you could earn more working in a coffee shop, for example, and they're arguing it's not fair. So the whole thing is saying they deserve a fair wage. Now, fair wage sounds intuitive, but I would argue it's actually ambiguous. So, like, what do we mean by fair wage, and how do we possibly quantify what a fair wage is? Now, there are a few ways you could argue this, but the one I'm going to focus on is the one that I think the BMA are using to argue that their workers aren't paid a fair wage. And that way is, well, let's look at real wages over time. So real wages in terms of accounting for inflation. What this means is that workers should not become worse off over time for the same work. So basically, their argument is, let's not be poorer than previous cohorts. And if you do track the real wages over time for resident doctors, and unfortunately for a lot of other public sector jobs, so teachers, nurses, civil servants, you will find that their real wage has fallen over time. So that's their argument for saying they're not being paid a fair wage. Now, whilst that is a valid argument, we must appreciate that the government does face constraints. The NHS in particular is tax funded. So from an economic standpoint, for me at least, I would say that, well, fairness is not only about the workers, which if you just look at real wages over time, that kind of is the argument. I would also say we need to include opportunity cost. If you are going to increase their pay, it means you're taking away something from somewhere else. And then I suppose you could just kind of have this knock-on effect of things not being fair. If falling real pay justifies strike action, then why aren't all public sector workers striking? And not only just striking, because I know some of them have been striking, but striking with the same intensity, because nurses and teachers, for example, they have gone on strike too, but by no means to the intensity that we find with doctors. I think part of the reason for this is that resident doctors occupy some kind of like chokehold here. So schools can remain open during a strike, for example, substitute or supply staff. You can kind of get them in quite quickly. But what I don't want to say is, I think people use that as an argument to say, well, it just goes to show how much more valuable doctors are. I don't like that argument. I don't think it means at all that their labour is less valuable. And in particular, I think for doctors, as opposed to maybe kind of like teachers or nurses, I think exit is much more feasible. So, for example, you'll hear a lot about our doctors emigrating to Australia or emigrating abroad, which, as soon as exit becomes much more feasible, I think collective action becomes much more likely too. And that doesn't then mean we're saying that their labour is much more valuable. Obviously, you get the standard arguments that go on about, well, how many years they spent at university, which means they must be much more highly skilled, and therefore it makes it more valuable, so on and so forth. Yeah, I do disagree with that. I know they spend a lot of these years at university. I don't think that means they're much more valuable than other workers, and I wonder if actually it is entirely necessary for all of those years to be spent at university, or maybe we've kind of just got stuck in a way like we deem it as incredibly professional, and it brings people comfort knowing that you spent this many years at university, and it's just the way it's been done, and therefore that's the way it's maintaining. I remember when it was coming out that the government had this argument or idea that people should be able to train to be a doctor via another route, so kind of much more via almost like an apprenticeship route. And yeah, the doctors I know, for example, although I'm not taking this as a whole, I have to find out more evidence. Yeah, really weren't happy with that. They didn't think it'd be possible for them to be good enough being trained that way. Even though I think a lot of their kind of training that is the most useful is the one that they spend in the hospital as opposed to the ones they spend in the lecture theatre. And I do wonder if it's just this almost trying to hold on to well, the way that they got trained being the most important, but also I think people like to feel as if it can't be done any other way. I think they like to feel special. Not just them. I think that happens to a lot of people in a lot of jobs. So instead of that, I think actually what we should focus on more is, well, is the wage path over time, is it fair and is it credible? So even though maybe we're arguing that, well, what they're getting paid now as a junior doctor or a resident doctor is low or not fair. What you've got to appreciate is that the lifetime earnings for a doctor are fantastic, right? Yes, okay, maybe if you took their per hour pay, it'd be the same as working in a coffee shop, but they're never going to stay at that point, right? That is kind of like the max for your coffee worker. But as the years progress, the pay for those doctors increases a lot. But then what you've got to appreciate is, well, hang on a minute. For them to access that higher pay, they need to be able to go on to the specialty training or the jobs. And unfortunately, at the moment, which I think is a fantastic counter argument for the resident doctors, is that, well, there's this lack of these specialty or training places, which means that this deferred compensation that we're expecting them to wait for, so that kind of like lifetime earnings, that higher pay later on, which is deferred compensation, it needs to be achievable or realistic. For it to be fair. So it's only fair if one can reasonably expect them to be able to reach said higher pay. So obviously, if it's not reasonable, then they don't want deferred compensation. They want to be compensated for the risk right now. So that was kind of why I suppose it was a little bit disappointing that when Wes Streeting's offer almost trying to address that, well, we're trying to make you go for this deferred compensation route. We're trying to make it much more likely to happen by improving these specialty and training programs, that the resident doctors or the group didn't go for that, which then does make me think actually kind of what they're interested in only is pay, whether or not it's fair, as opposed to kind of like career progression and lifetime earnings, which is by far kind of better than you would receive in the jobs that they're comparing themselves to now. So I'm sure this will kind of like, I'm sure everyone has opinions on this. I'm sure this will touch a nerve with some people, but let me know what you think. Obviously, I'm going to link anywhere I've got kind of information from down below. But yeah, let me know what you think. So let me know what you think. I'm sure everyone has opinions on this, and I think unfortunately the opinions seem to be based on a few things. One, kind of what your financial situation is now. If that's kind of not great, then maybe this idea that other people are arguing for a pay rise. Well, I suppose you could be for it because you think everyone needs a pay rise. Or maybe you'll be a bit kind of annoyed because, well, why can they be fighting for a pay rise and I can't fight for a pay rise? Similarly, it's your health situation. If you are struggling to get a health appointment that you desperately need and you hear that these doctors are going on strike, then again, maybe you'll think that them going on strike is unfair. So let me know what you think. Hopefully we can get a bit of a conversation going or a debate going. And yeah, bye guys.